Hi, this is David Bernstein with the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values. I'm very pleased to be with my co-host, Monica Osborne, from the Jewish Journal and the Speech Project of the Jewish Journal, and our special guest today, Maxim Shrayer, who is a professor of Russian, English, and Jewish Studies at Boston College. He is the founder of the Jewish Studies program. He's the author of 20 books in English and Russian, and one of his most recent ones is Of Politics and Pandemics. So we have a lot to talk about. He was born in Moscow and to a Refusenik family, and made his way to the United States in 1987. So Monica, why don't you start us off?
Great. Thanks, David. And again, Maxime, we're so happy to have you and to be in discussion with you today. So I know that David just said that he gave a little bit about your background, but I would love if you could talk just a little bit about some of the details, the specific details of your background.
Absolutely. Well, just a tiny bit about my roots. So on three sides, we, as many Soviet Jews, come from Ukraine, and before that, Poland, of course. Both my late grandfathers were born in Kamenets-Podilsk, which was a provincial capital not far from the Austro-Hungarian border. And on one side, on my father's maternal, we are Litvaks, coming from a long dynasty of rabbis in the area of Šiauliai. Going back, I trace it back to the beginning of the 18th century. All my late grandparents, as young people, made a transition, essentially immigrated from the former Pale of Settlement into big Soviet cities, where they became Soviet professionals and members of the new Soviet intelligentsia. That was all before World War II and the Shoah. My parents were born, my mother, Emilia Shrayer, who's a translator, in Moscow. My father, David Shrayer Petrov, who's a writer and medical scientist, in Leningrad. I was almost born in Leningrad because my mom at first moved to Leningrad to be with my father, but couldn't take the climate. It's a little bit like coming from, what shall we say, from San Diego to Boston. And basically, I was born in Moscow. And really, the breaking point is my parents' decision to emigrate, which came around 1977-78, which was formalized in 1979. And of course, as children realize, sometimes even their parents, whom they idealize, sometimes miscalculate. The miscalculation was one that thousands of other Refuseniks made, which is that we got stuck in Refusenik's limbo instead of being allowed to emigrate. 1979, as you remember, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, a new cycle of Cold War and confrontation, bad years for East-West relations, and particularly bad years for Soviet Jews. We're talking about tens of thousands of Refuseniks in big Soviet cities, particularly Moscow and Leningrad. So I was formed for almost 10 years in the Refusenik milieu, and also living, of course, a double life, one of, in some sense, a normal, if you can call a kid from the Jewish minority in, a Soviet school normal, but at least outwardly normal Soviet student and then university student. And the other life, which in some ways was the one that mattered the most, was the life of the Refusenik activist community. So that's briefly the story. And of course, we go into more details, but I think the Refusenik background, the Jewish background, and also I should point out, my parents both were never members of the party, which is significant because in their Soviet careers, they probably achieved as much as a non-party member Jewish professional could. And so the decision to emigrate really was not based on economic or professional anxieties. It was based principally on two points. One is the life of Jews in the Soviet Union, popular and state-sponsored anti-Semitism, and of course, not wanting to live in a totalitarian state.
Right. Something that David and I have talked about in the past is this idea of some of the similarities in terms of what's happening right now in the United States, in the context of all of these culture wars, some of these things that are happening seem to, I don't know if mirror is the right word, but they do seem to have some similarities with some of the stories that we've historically heard coming out of, this era that you're describing. That's very much a part of your background. And I know personally that so many of my friends and colleagues who do have a Refusenik background or were formerly part living in the Soviet Union, particularly as Jews, are on a kind of heightened alert right now in terms of what's going on in the US. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how your background and the little bit that you've just described inform how you see what's happening in terms of what some of us see as a full-blown assault on liberalism.
Sure. No, you're absolutely correct. This is a challenging time for the country. It's a challenging time for all of us Americans. I think it's in some ways, a doubly challenging time for American Jews, because I think all of a sudden they're experiencing sort of what Soviet Jews experienced in 1967. I would argue, oddly, a kind of rude or crude awakening. 1967 being, I remember this time very well. I was born on June 5th, 1967, during the Six-Day War. Essentially, when you wake up to realize that your own country is pointing, guns at you, and this is essentially the beginning of the great Jewish exodus from the Soviet Union. I think something of this sort, and of course, it's very important not to mistake similarities for differences and differences for similarities. We are not living in a totalitarian state, and the fact that we are, could be proved simply by the fact that we're having this conversation. We wouldn't be having this conversation in the Soviet Union. But nevertheless, what I mean, and I'm honestly thinking out loud, because I don't think it's a parallel that has been fully explored. The sort of rude awakening of the American Jewish community that has been happening, let's say, over the past 3 years. Let's not even go all the way to the beginning of the Trump era, but actually it's kind of late Trump era and the election, the defeat of Trump, and particularly the emergence of the radical left in the Democratic Party. I would describe it as the experience of the breathing and living space that is being shrunk from both the right and the left. And I find that particularly troubling, in the sense that, of course, I think the old Refuseniks, and perhaps most, if not all Soviet Jews, in some sense are better equipped because they lived through terror, they lived through open, unabashed persecution. But even so, I think for those who made America, as opposed to Israel, their home, it is a very difficult moment. And I can tell you what I am feeling. I am feeling increasingly, and I've spoken about this, I'm actually trying to work out some of this in a piece I'm working on. I call it the loneliness of an American Refusenik, which is basically the sense that, imagine having lived through, having fought for the right to express yourself fully as a Jew in the Soviet Union, having made a decision, which is for many of us, a decision that affected our lives, the lives of our children, not to go to Israel, but to go to the United States, which one should not underestimate the difficulty of that decision for some former Refusenik. And really having felt for the past 30, 40 years that America gave Soviet Jews a great deal, not just of opportunities, but also of breathing room, of freedom. Certainly, if someone were to have asked me if I saw this encroaching assault on liberal values that we're experiencing today, coming both from the radical left and the radical right, I probably would have laughed in their face if they were to tell me 35 years ago that this is what we were going to experience. And I think that's kind of the paradox, because in a sense, and this is not an atypical kind of argument that ex-Soviet Jews who are more conservative than myself would make, simply don't have illusions about socialism. You live through socialism. Socialism grows like mushrooms. It's going to grow again wherever, or like mildew. But there's more to that, of course. And I think it's much harder to contend with the simultaneous growth. I mean, we had Charlottesville, right, where Jews were told openly that Nazism is still alive and well in this country. But we also have, I call them vengeance Democrats, justice Democrats, right? Essentially, the radical socialists in the Democratic Party who I think are fighting a war against the soul and body of the Jewish people now. And how do you live in a place like that? I'm personally beginning to think of an escape. And for me to acknowledge that is essentially to acknowledge that my family probably might have miscalculated, which is a terrible thing to say.
Yeah. So go ahead. I'm sorry, Monica.
I just have one follow-up question, and then I'd love to pass it over to you, David. I wonder if there's a disconnect between two things that you're saying, and I think there probably isn't, but I'm hoping you can connect the dots for me. So on one hand, we are not living in a totalitarian regime, right? There's no question about that. As you said, we couldn't have this discussion if in fact we were. And yet on the other hand, you, like many others, including myself, are preparing an escape plan. So I guess the question is, totalitarianism doesn't happen overnight. It's a process. It's something that we bear witness to or we observe as it's happening, either without realizing it or pretending we're not seeing it. So correct. I guess one of the questions I have is when do we sound the alarm, right?
You're absolutely right,
when is that process happening? And then I'll say about a year ago, I was part of there were scholars across the world. We did a live virtual reading of Hannah Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism. And the ensuing discussion was very interesting because some felt that we were in a moment of, totalitarianism, like its birth here in the United States. But the interesting thing, many felt that way, as a matter of fact, but the interesting thing is that some saw it as coming from the far right and others saw it as coming from the far left. Personally, I saw it coming from both sides and closing in, right? Starting to encroach on the liberal values that occupy the space to the left of the center and to the right of the center. And which touches on something you said as well, which is this idea that it's not coming from one side or the other. This is coming from two different sides. So again, my question for you is, when do we sound the alarm?
Right. So I think you made very excellent points. Let's try to sort of sort this out, because it's not just when we sound the alarm, but also how to make sense of the simultaneously encroaching assaults on liberal values coming from the extreme right and the extreme left. I mean, of course, there are thinkers, there have been thinkers, both political scientists, political philosophers, and writers of fiction like Vladimir Nabokov, who essentially viewed what he called commune Nazism as one force, perhaps two subspecies of the same totalitarian species, but not all of them. I don't think Hannah Arendt, for instance, did. I think she sometimes cut socialist thinkers and some extreme socialists slack. But that's a different issue. I think Vasily Grossman emerged, having been prior to World War II, essentially a committed supporter of the Soviet project. He really felt that Jews were beholden to the Soviet Union because a Jew in 1938 felt safe in the Soviet Union and not safe in Warsaw and not safe in Berlin. But he comes out of World War II and the Shoah really believing that Stalinism and Hitlerism are much more alike than they are disparate. But that being what it is, I think the question of when to sound the alarm is perhaps the most pressing one. I think why, and again, I'm no political scientist, which is why I'm never comfortable speaking about this. I can only speak as an observer and as someone who is more interested in the particulars than in the generals, who observes this more as a writer than anything else. I think sometimes the alarm is sounded for us, and we know when a totalitarian leader emerges, a dictator emerges. In a sense, then it's much easier to answer your question. The challenge today, Monica, I think, is that the anti-liberal totalitarian forces are masking, disguising themselves as forces of justice. And I think a lot of people are intoxicated by the sweet rhetoric of justice and are not recognizing that people like members of the Squad and many more are really, I personally think they are employing a crude version of Soviet Marxism, not even Cuban, Soviet Marxism. Why do I say not even Cuban? Because in a sense, they are just scratching the surface of the very superficial Soviet lazy Marxist rhetoric. It's not even hardcore revolutionary rhetoric. It's kind of lazy and complacent, but at that, fundamentally, I think it's making an assault on liberal values. And it's no surprise that Jews are such a target for them, because I think we are particularly sensitive, having lived a particularly interesting trajectory in history, to assaults against liberal values. We as Jews hold them very dear, I would say.
Yeah.
So basically, go ahead, David.
Yeah, I want to go more into the sort of the Jewish condition in a second, but before we do that, I want to sort of play out this idea that it's coming from both sides. I agree, it's coming from both sides. The question is it the same thing coming from both sides? Some have suggested that what we're seeing is sort of a populism on the right and an ideology on the left, and that there really is not a fully fleshed out ideological framework on the right. In fact, it doesn't really have any coherent form. It's sort of just this populism that can move with whatever political figure happens to be the chief spokesperson for it, in this case, Trump. What do you think about that idea that we might not actually be seeing the same sort of assault coming from both directions of the political spectrum?
My sense is that even true blue fascists on the right have enough common sense, or are being advised by forces more intelligent than these activists not to resort to traditional right-wing Nazi like rhetoric. And so you refer to it as populism, I suspect because it is being delivered this way. And note, for instance, how of late, all these people have been referring to themselves as Jews in Nazi Germany. Where is all this coming from, right? A congresswoman says that, a conservative teacher somewhere in the South says that. It's as though someone is telling them, this is your protective garb. You compare yourselves to Jews in this political climate. I think what we're seeing on the extreme left is unabashed rhetoric of vengeance. And so it's easier, in a sense, to identify it, to classify it, right? So in other words, my point is, I think it's considerably more tolerated in many enlightened circles of this country, particularly on campuses, among the left-leaning intelligentsia, to employ Marxist rhetoric and revolutionary rhetoric. It's people don't think that there is anything particularly threatening about it. But if people start, quoting Mein Kampf, everybody, obviously points fingers at them. I mean, I'm just as concerned about.
Right. Yes. So there's a concern, of course, that this ideology, and here I think we're talking primarily the left, perhaps you could expand it to the right, but this critical social justice ideology, it has specific and unique implications to the Jewish community and to the Jewish condition in America. It sounds like you're saying, well, whenever liberalism is on the run, so are Jews, and that's true. But I think there may be other ways, even if we're not on the run, even if we're staying put, that that this illiberal ideology can affect this. Do you have some insight into how Jews might be particularly affected by this ideology in a way that goes beyond just the generalized threat of illiberalism in this country?
Yes, well, first of all, honestly, and David, you know that I had some discomfort about this because I'm no authority on critical race theory. And to tell you the truth, I don't particularly want to be an authority,
right,
because I think it will just make me mad. No, I mean, and I have a lot in my life that is already intellectual turbulence.
Right.
I feel like it's just as, when my children tell me about all the new pronouns that they employ with such ease, and I ask them, well, how do you say this? How do you refer to this particular person? I feel like the old English judge who asked what the internet was. In other words, when I went to graduate school, critical race theory did not exist. We had other things, right, Monica? And so, look, I have to inform myself about it, but I also, in a sense, am probably taking the easy road, saying I'm too old to master this. Now, that being what it is, I think what is very difficult for Jews, at least from my conception of Jewish peoplehood, Jewish identity, Jewish history, is that no matter how you slice it, it seems that critical race theory is very uncomfortable with traditional configurations of Jewish identity. Because Jews are neither white nor non-white. Jews exist in multiple identities. Look, it's the experience of why I say, go to Israel if you want to understand what Jews are like. You walk the streets of Israel, you see Jewish people who look black, who look brown, they're even Asian, and also a multiplicity of Jews, even if you talk about European origins. This, I think, sits very poorly with critical race theory and its approach to the human condition and to those who suffer and those who create suffering. In a sense, Jewish suffering is, in a sense, I think critical race theory tries to cancel Jewish suffering, tries to cancel millennia of Jewish history because it simply complicates their existence. And what simplistic binary theories do when something complicates their existence, I think, I hope I'm right, is they cancel the very things that complicate their existence. Right.
So in that, let's assume you're correct, and I think you are.
I'm not sure. I'm sorry, David, can I say it's the same in a sense. Look, read what Karl Marx writes about the Jewish question. Right. In a sense, it's an iteration of arguments which are not very sophisticated, but are suffused with anger. Are suffused with discomfort about who you are. Marx, of course, was deeply uncomfortable with the fact that he had a Jewish grandfather who was a rabbi, right? With the fact that his family became apostates. And so in writing about Jews, I think he also tries to make up for all the discomfort he has with himself, for better or for worse. Yes, go ahead, David.
So it seems to me that if you're right about that, that the Jewish community has one of two responses. One, it can say, we'll try to engage the sort of oppression Olympics and prove that we are an oppressed minority, just like blacks, just like trans and other peoples are, and we'll make our claim and try to insinuate ourselves into the intersectional community. Or we can say we're not going to play that game at all. In fact, we think the game itself is rigged, it's problematic, and it's not the best description of American society, which is a society that is not basically oppressive. Do you have a sense of what the best adaptive mechanism should be? Should it be to try to prove ourselves, or should we challenge the entire ideology?
Very interesting question. Truly, and I've thought about it in my own way, because I'm very sensitive to questions of what I viscerally perceive as injustice, particularly racism, xenophobia, prejudice of any sort. And so my response is, I guess, twofold. First, I think Jews have earned the right not to prove anything to anybody. And I don't mean just the Shoah. I mean, it's like, you travel in Poland. There are very few Jews, but the place is suffused with Jewish memory. You can't go to a village cemetery and not find some remains of Jewish life. And so no matter what the current Polish regime says about Jewish memory, I think Jewish memory has proven itself. In a sense, it's my view overall. I don't think Jews need to feel pressed upon to justify their existence in this new world where, say, intersectionalism is beginning to rule supreme. On the other hand, I don't think Jews should change their commitment to social justice, which is why I've said this before. I will continue to fight against racism no matter what. Does it please me that the political movement that calls itself Black Lives Matter used to have openly anti-Jewish lines in their program? Of course, it's terrible, and I couldn't support this movement. But it does not mean that as a Jew, I am any less comfortable fighting against prejudice, racism, and social injustice. It's, in a sense, we have had these commitments from the very beginning of the modern era, or perhaps one could say from the emancipation of the Jews of Europe, if one wants to just look at the past 300 years, right?
Yep.
Which is why, I mean, look, why is Dreyfus such an attractive target? Of course, because on top of everything, he's from Alsace. This is the beginning of the emancipation of Europe. People need to understand that the French anti-Semites target him for multiple reasons.
Yes. So in this current discourse, Israel tends to get caught up as well. It's a binary ideology, and it views oppressed versus oppressor. And we saw that in the most recent Gaza conflict, that Israel was labeled almost in an unqualified way by sort of those forces on the progressive left as being an oppressor state. I interviewed somebody earlier today who said that there were literally hundreds of statements from various academic departments around the United States that targeted Israel or condemned Israel without ever accepting any sort of complication or complexity in the narrative at all. So what is your view on that? Is that make the Jewish condition more complicated? How should we think about that? What should we do about it?
Yeah, no, this troubles me perhaps the most because the war against Israel, or the war against Zionism, which is almost directly taken from the legacy of the Soviet experience, specifically Soviet. Other Marxist regimes did not quite practice. China did not, Cuba did not, and Eastern Bloc countries to a lesser degree. But in the Soviet Union, from the 1970s, anti-Zionism became a way of fighting the Jew openly, without coming across as anti-Semites. This was really eaten from the hands of the Soviet legacy by those on the left and those members of the academic community and the intelligentsia who have, in May of this past May, been out attacking Israel, signing letters letters that came from all quarters, all circles. I'm not just talking about members of Jewish studies. Members of almost any department felt compelled. This is actually very Soviet, Monica. If I were to say what is Soviet, it's the joke about Dr. Zhivago. I didn't read Dr. Zhivago, but I still disapprove. You know, when Dr. Zhivago appeared, when Pasternak was given the Nobel Prize, even though Pasternak, Jewish born, was very much aligned with Christianity and saw himself as a Russian writer, but he all of a sudden was the Jewish traitor to the Soviet regime. And there were all these factory meetings where people were sort of forced to participate in open vilification of Pasternak. And so the joke was, you know, I haven't read Dr. Zhivago, but I disapprove. So in a sense, many of the letters are exactly that, because these people don't know anything about Israel. They have never been to Israel. They don't understand the conflict. And yet something drives them to attack Israel. What is it? This is the part that I think requires precision and articulateness from us. And my answer is it's a certain deep-seated prejudice against Jews, which is coming out this way, right? They can't say we don't like Jews. They can't say, oh, these Jews, they have great jobs, they have money, they, you know, look, they have so many chairs, they, you know, they've done so well. They can't say that, but what they can say is Israel is an apartheid state, and that goes.
You're a Jewish studies professor, among other things. You're founder of the Jewish Studies program at Boston College. I know from Jonathan Sarna, who I interviewed on this podcast, I know from others in the field that Jewish studies has become ideologically complicated. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, Jonathan is a friend whom I admire greatly, and I'm sure he had very sensible things to say about it, more sensible than I do, because he tends to speak with a great deal of calm and objectivity. He's an historian. I think I tend to sometimes over-emotionalize these things, but for whatever it's worth, I can tell you, I still do not have my hand fully on the pulse of campus life because last year, the entire year, I wasn't on campus. I taught remotely in the fall, and I have been on research leave this whole year, this whole semester. So 2 months from now, when I go back to teaching, when I experience the temperature on campus, I think I'll be able to answer this question more responsibly. The exception being is I teach at a Catholic Jesuit university. And I think the climate traditionally at these campuses has not been, luckily, thank God, anti-Israeli. And so probably colleagues who teach at land-grant universities or at some upper tier private colleges have it much harder than I do. That being what it may, I think we have entered a new era in which, how can I put it to you? There, of course, like the ones speaking this afternoon, Monica, David, you, and myself. Obviously, we take exception to that position, but there are many colleagues in Jewish studies who somehow feel like they have to swear allegiance to that rhetoric which brands Israel a militaristic apartheid state. Maybe it's a survivalism, maybe it is opportunism, maybe it's cowardice. There are all sorts of explanations, but I have no desire to apologize them. I think there's no way to apologize for that. I think anybody who engages in vilification of Israel, particularly collective vilification of Israel, should be very clear that, you know, once you get into that mode, it's very hard to go back. I mean, look, of course, the Jewish tradition is very accepting of mistakes. right? Which is why, if you look at the history of Jewish apostasy, for instance, why I think of Jewish apostasy in this connection, because in a sense, right, Jewish apostates leave the faith, they convert, but remember, some have returned. Which is why I'm not closing the door. I think some of our colleagues will come to their senses, maybe 10 years from now. Just remember, Schoenberg returned to Judaism, and Marc Chagall was a witness, signed his reaffirmation certificate. I always think about that because, look, mistakes are made, but I still don't want, which is why, look, if I could be honest, I think on Jews is a little harsh.
I'm sorry, what's harsh?
The term on Jews.
On Jews, right.
It interests me very much conceptually, but I think it draws the line too harshly. I think this is not the time to be writing anybody out. I think it's a very difficult moment. It's a moment of despair and confusion. And so my sense is, David, and I could be mistaken, that some of the people who have spoken have done so in haste, have done so under pressure, and may regret and retract their anti-Israel vitriol.
We can only hope. Monica, do you have any final questions?
No, I think this is really great. I mean, the one thing I will add is, I think that, for so many Jewish studies scholars, it's become a litmus test, right? Like, will you hold Israel's feet to the flame? Will you do that? And I think you're right. I think that I hope with you that some of our colleagues will turn from that perspective or revisit it at the very least.
It's good to know that there are scholars like the two of you who are still part of the scholarly community who can talk some sense. Thank you both for this conversation. Maxim, we really appreciate you sharing your wisdom with us. Look forward to your next book and the book after that, I'm sure.
Thanks so much, David,
okay.
Monica. Really wonderful to see you.